We live at a time when we are examining a number of racial issues as that it's all roiling through the country and trying to establish what it is we believe, especially when we look at our past. When we look at the beginnings of a priesthood ban that existed in the LDS Church for such a long time, we try and look at the genesis of how that decision was made. And that decision gets laid a lot on at the feet of Brigham Young, and the question gets asked, well, was Brigham Young a racist? What was he doing? What was he thinking? That's a complicated question, because as recently we've been able to have access to the records of the Territorial Congress, which took place, Territorial Legislature, that took place in Fillmore in 1852 as the territory of Deseret, to be Utah, was being put together, and we have the conversations and the arguments that were flowing back and forth. Why is 1852 so important? Because that's when there was a decision made whether the territory of Utah would be a slave territory or free territory. And the discussions and the arguments back and forth were recorded in shorthand, which just under the last few years, in the last 4 years, we've been able to go in and recover all those things in shorthand, find some old shorthand experts that still run around that know how to read shorthand as it existed back then. So the complicated questions that we really don't have a lot of answers to include things like this. 2 weeks prior to a decision being made in the territorial legislature that the state of Deseret would allow slavery in the first generation, their children would be free, but that generation would still be there would still be slaves, and if some of them was coming from the south, that they would be able to hold on to their slaves, that those slaves could be bought and sold. 2 weeks prior to that decision in 1852, Brigham Young had said no, and in fact had kind of leaned towards the fact that there were members of the church who were black who were receiving the priesthood, and that was being mixed then with how he looked at slavery. 2 weeks later, he appears to have made a sudden shift in favor of not only granting slaveholders the ability to hold slaves in the state of Deseret, but that also that black members of the church would not be ordained to the priesthood going forward. And that decision, and we could say, well, that was a decision of that's the way the people were at the time. Well, there were others like Orson Pratt that were very vocal in saying that if we do this, the angels will blush at our decision, and he pushed back quite loudly against Brigham Young on that matter. It was, to Brigham Young's credit, it was left to others in the generations that spun all of the reasons for why there would be not just slavery, but the fact that the black members of the church would not be given the priesthood, and it gave rise to all of these now widely discredited views of things like they were fence sitters in the pre-existence, or that all the members of Cain's spiritual family would have to accept the gospel before anybody of Abel's would have to accept the gospel before any of Cain's could, and that anybody who was black was a descendant of Cain. And so you had all of these kind of religious philosophies rolling around that, in all fairness, weren't strictly seen by members of the church. That was often widely believed. But there were a number of things going on, including a freed slave that had married a white sister and kind of created some havoc back in Far West, and that there was some sense that maybe that was impacting on Brigham Young's mind. So, complicated question with not a lot of answers. Certainly through our viewpoint, does it seem like that was a bit of a racist decision by a man who, across all other measures, was an incredible prophet, colonizer, and inspired leader? It does appear that way. Did it cause untold pain and misery that still echoes down the centuries? It did. And again, it's one of those things that we have to almost kind of put on the shelf and say, we have far more questions than we have answers, and are grateful that the 1978 revelation came to Spencer Kimball, reversing all of that. But the idea of Brigham Young's involvement and the decisions that he made, we just don't have great documentation on it, other than we just look at the result of that. And I think for so many wish that decision had been different. Our leaders are often flawed and are going to make great decisions, and then sometimes they make horrific decisions, and this appears to be one of them. Anyway, there's our history, and let's see what we do with it. Thanks.